previous sessions, in some ways the title summarizes the talk. So, and as you can gather, my view is that sanctions are part of war. I'm going to talk about sanctions and blockade in some way as both a pre-war weapon, continuation of politics in other ways. Sanctions are one way of looking at it, as part of war, and then as post-war to punish the defeated country. So it really is an integral part of war. And I think if we start with looking at earlier blockades, siege, before it was called sanctions, when people used to call it siege maybe. The picture that we had before was the Athens during the Peloponnesian Wars, and the Spartans basically blockaded it. I'm sure it's not a real picture, it's a depiction in a history book of this, and it shouldn't be trusted. I know from Persian Greek wars depicted in our school books that these pictures are very exaggerated, but still it gives you an impression of what was going on. And then we had the siege, for example, in 15th century, the same principles, and people did remember Spartans and Athens, but the same principle was used against Constantinople in 1453. And there were different ways in which this was done, either tactically as a weapon to isolate a particular port, a particular town, to weaken the people in that particular place, but more importantly, strategically as a way of weakening your enemy. And once you weaken your enemy, your chances of war, of winning the war were better, inevitably better. By the 16th, 17th century, we are entering a period where major European powers have invested in maritime forces. They are major trading countries. There is competition between them. There's intercolonial competition. And countries become the power by increasing their naval power. So become the dominant force within various maritime orders. So we have, for example, the Dutch fighting the Spanish, and the Dutch actually blockade Flemish ports to stop Spanish ships getting there. And that's part of their strategy in defeating the Spanish Empire, the Spanish colonial power. This is in 1584, 16th century, that kind of time. And of course, this continues during the First World War. We see this before the First World War. There are ways in which the whole thing is moving more into not just siege in terms of military siege, but additional to it, financial siege, because we are seeing the internationalization of trade and capital and global capital between 1870 and 1940. And therefore, the material conditions for moving from increasing the blockade, both in terms of naval blockade or siege of various towns, but moving it in addition to the financial sector. And of course, Britain is becoming by this time a major maritime power, it's a major colonial power, and it writes laws and it sets, there is a London Convention about naval and maritime regulation, maritime law, including in it the issues of blockade. And Britain is the leading force in this. Britain is, if you like, the London Conventions decide who can do what. But by the time the First World War comes, obviously Britain couldn't care less about this. All these conventions, all these maritime laws are thrown into the dustbin, and Britain and other countries try and isolate Germany with blockades. And the idea is both to stop supplies getting there, but also stopping trade with that country and so on. After 1918, after the blockade of Germany continues, in fact, many people have written that the Versailles Treaty played a very important role in making Germany feel isolated, in that if you like, even the food blockade wasn't removed completely after the armistice of 1918. Between the two wars, as you know, there was this League of Nations that was set up to regulate international relations. And there's a lot of talk that this League of Nations was ineffective. In some ways it was, but from reading the history of various sanctions and blockades, it actually had one of its most effective sections or parts was what was called the economic section of the League of Nations. And this economic section did play quite an important role in imposing or threatening sanctions, right? On continuing the sanctions on Germany in some ways, but also threatening sanctions against smaller countries. And in some ways, some of the illusions about sanctions comes from this period, maybe, because major powers threatened smaller, weaker countries, such as in one case, Yugoslavia in 1921, and in a second case, Greece, when it was almost getting into a war with Bulgaria in 1925, where the League of Nations threat of economic sanctions by major powers stopped these wars getting hot wars. But the relationship between the threat of sanction by major powers and small countries in what were really border disputes is not the same as the kind of sanctions that the successor to the League of Nations, the United Nations, and in particular the United States, with the United States' role in the United Nations, have imposed later. But for all the history, these are the two examples that the people who defend sanctions as peaceful means of deterring people can come up with, and they're really insignificant, in my opinion. By the Second World War, well, again, France and Britain were restricting supplies of minerals, fuel, food, textile, needed both as consumption in Germany, by Nazi Germany by now, and by Italy, the fascist dictatorship in Italy. And here there is no attempt at presenting this as, sanction being peaceful. It's actually presented by the Allies as economic warfare. They term the terms they use is economic warfare against Germany. So it's quite clear it's part of war, is it, if you like, the second stage that I was talking about. And in the 1950s, we have Korean War. Again, this time we have the UN Security Council. The UN has been set up. The UN is very much under the influence of major powers, but the United States has a very important role in it. And the UN imposes sanctions against North Korea. Some of these sanctions, I noticed, still continue. So they set them up in 1950s and they're still there. The Vietnam War sanctions are very interesting because when Kissinger presents the idea of mining the port of Haiphong, which is necessary during the Vietnam War, he actually says this is the continuation of blockade. I.e., he admits that blockade, mining the port, are more or less the same thing. It's just one process. It's the same process. So he clearly didn't think that the blockade of Haiphong was a peaceful act, because once you add mining, it certainly is. And in more modern times, of course, we first had sanctions during the Iran-Iraq war, and that's the 1980s. Most of you, some of you wouldn't know which years it was. And this is quite an interesting period. I'll speak about sanctions on Iran later, because that's my special, this is the area I know best. But the Iran-Iraq war was interesting in that although Saddam had the support of the West, France, United States, all the European countries really, UK, for the war, after, I think, 81 or 82, the UN passed this motion about not selling arms to either Iran or Iraq. This was in addition to US sanctions, which had started because of the revolutions. That was separate from that. And of course, we then see how sanctions are used by Western governments to either negotiate, as Mike was talking yesterday during the Iran Gate, to negotiate release of hostages, which ended up in a very complicated situation that I can explain later in the question time. But more importantly for UK, we had arms sold to Iraq by various companies, and the Minister for Procurement in the Ministry of Defense was a certain Alan Clark. Those of you who know, who've been horrified by Boris Johnson's antics in the last few months, you should have met Alan Clark. He makes Boris Johnson look like quite an ordinary standard.
What did he call his dog?
I can't remember.
Brown.
Oh, okay, okay. I mean, the guy lived in a tower, in a castle type place. He was born into aristocracy and so on, but he obviously needed more money. I think the tower needed maintenance or something. And he was passing, I'm sure he was getting paid by it, but there was a company called Churchill Matrix that was selling to Saddam Hussein these long tubes that are used in land-to-land missiles. Those days, that was the way Saddam was waging war. So people in Iranian cities would wake up with these huge things landing on their streets that exploded. And even if you were in a shelter, you could easily get killed. But I know a lot of people who are still psychologically damaged by the sound of these weapons, because they were terrible. And the wonderful Churchill Matrix sold these. Alan Clark signed them off as if there was nothing wrong with that. And he made millions out of it. Of course, in Britain then they had the Scott inquiry, if I'm not mistaken, and a number of inquiries about Alan Clark's various activities during that period. But that didn't stop the fact that Saddam Hussein got his hands on what were something you couldn't easily smuggle into Iraq, as far as I can see, unless you really didn't go through, you managed to go through the blockade or the sanctions as they were called. And of course, I would say that in that war, both for Iran's mistakes, but at the end of the day, Saddam was the winner of that war. I think historically that did happen. But sanctions against Iraq then continued in the 1990s, because foolishly he thought he'd won this war, Saddam. He then went and invaded Kuwait, as some of you will remember. And so sanctions then continued, UN sanctions, US sanctions, and added to this was just not arms, but general sanctions continued against the Iraqi government. The UN resolutions about this included not just military equipment, but scientific software. And it's quite interesting because clearly they thought scientific software, which as we saw during yesterday's talk, can be quite important part of a warfare. Scientific software was deemed by the US as part of the sanctions. I remember when I was in Glasgow University, I was in an aerospace department, and all the we had to sign these various software things. And the two countries that were on top of there were three countries that were definitely you shouldn't share this software with. They were Iran, Iraq, China, and then later Sudan was added. I think this was when Osama bin Laden went to Sudan, but anyway, that's a different. The UN resolution had some provisions about food and what it calls, and I've looked at the resolution, what it calls humanitarian aid to Iraq. But again, as always with the UN, there are these wonderful sentences in their Security Council statements. I have no, if you like, guarantee of how this would be done. So there was no provision on who would classify what is humanitarian or food or medical supplies to Iraq. And at some stage, I think it's 1995, yeah, 1995, the US started stopping Iraq selling oil, right? So it was already escalating the conflict with Iraq. And we had what was called the Oil for Food program. So Iraq was not in a position to sell its oil unless it was just getting food for it. And again, you think, how do you control something like that? But they had, I presume there were some arrangements. This was a Bill Clinton initiative, and the aim was clearly to weaken Saddam Hussein. There was no doubt. I think everyone would agree that the Oil for Food program was a disaster. It didn't work. So if you look at people who've written about the Iraq sanctions, you will see how people are saying there was illness, there was food shortages, there was malnutrition caused by this. And it's interesting because later Madeleine Albright, who was the State Department's chief, the State Department person, she was asked for a reaction for the fact that, I think again, a UN humanitarian organization had estimated that as much as 500,000 Iraqi children died because of sanctions, right? So that's quite a high figure if you think of it. And her reply was, well, we think the price is right. That's a famous quote from Madeleine Albright. And you can see how they were thinking about that. But did these sanctions bring down Saddam? No, of course they didn't. He was in power long after Bill Clinton left office, right? And they only stopped, basically, the main sanctions against Iraq stopped in 2003 after the US invaded and imposed its own government there practically. And then that was followed by the pro-occupation Shia government, but they didn't manage to bring down Saddam. In the Middle East, the other sanctions that one shouldn't forget are the sanctions against Gaza. They started in 2009. They still continue. This is an interesting one. I'm really, I found it very amusing, because the UN goes around, the US goes around the Middle East and tells countries, oh, you're a dictatorship. Your elections last time were just not democratic. That's why we are imposing sanctions against you. Yeah? And it has done, I mean, it's actually done that with Iran or other countries in the region. And yet, when the Palestinians voted for Hamas, I don't like Hamas, but they voted for Hamas. This is a democratic vote. Whether we like it or not, this was a vote. Then the Israelis imposed sanctions on Gaza, and then the US imposed sanctions following that. So now Gaza, although it has a seafront, can't get anything except via Egypt on land. And then there's these tunnels that, as you know, are used for smuggling and all sorts of other things. So it's interesting because then they wonder why people don't take them seriously in the Middle East when they go around saying this is not a democratic country. Well, there were 1953 Iran, Mossadegh, you overthrew him. It was a vote, a popular vote. Again, I'm not a great fan of Mossadegh, but he clearly had the popular vote. And there's Hamas, and you don't approve of it. So it's not just voting, it's voting for the right person and the right party that stops you getting sanctions. So I'm now going to talk a bit about Iran sanctions. It is one of the longest, probably, ongoing live sanctions. It's live because right now there is still a negotiation in Vienna going on about the Iran's nuclear deal, and sanctions are top of that agenda. So that agenda is really dealing with the complexity of, they call it themselves, I mean, the US actually agrees, the complexity of this long list of sanctions that exist against Iran. In the US, I was following up various podcasts and so on. It's actually called the sanctions industry. There's so many academics working on Iran sanctions. There's a legal firm in Washington that specializes in Iran sanctions. So, you know, there's a whole, it's a whole big industry. I mean, we're just, I've only just touched the edges of it. But the first sanctions were imposed in 1979, the Carter administration, the US embassy, the siege of the US embassy in Tehran. These are, there's a lot of debate right now in Vienna as to which of the sanctions can be removed if there is a deal. I mean, it's still a big question if there's a deal. But so some of these are coming back as part of day-to-day news now, because, well, is the 1979 sanction anything to do with the nuclear program? No. So it must stay. That's the US argument. The Iranian argument is, well, if you're removing sanctions but keeping big chunks of it, how can we, what does that mean? How can we say we can get back to normal economic life? So Bill Clinton probably imposed some of the worst sanctions against Iran, and they were in 1995. There was a US executive order. I think that means the president kind of signs it or whatever. But that was prohibiting all US trade with Iran. And that was valid for quite a long time. There was a very short period during the presidency of Khatami, 1997, where the US eased some sanctions against Iran. This was because he was a reformist. The assumption was that he will open up the country. He did to a certain extent. The problem with Iran's reformists in terms of internal politics is that they were also the flag bearers of neoliberal economic policies, and therefore, of course, the US wanted, IMF wanted Iran integrated, some of the sanctions in the world economy, some of the sanctions were eased, but they didn't go away. And then we have the Bush administration, and here we are looking at sanctions because of nuclear development. In 2005, there is the Bush administration's first set of serious sanctions against Iran. Now, one thing that actually makes them quite unpopular is that he goes for cultural boycott, academic and cultural boycott of Iran. And that actually doesn't go down well with the people in the country, because that's not the kind of things that you would go first for. But obviously remember, Bush had this view and had people in his administration like John Bolton, who called Iran part of the axis of evil, having overthrown Saddam so successfully, as we now know, 20 years later, almost 20 years later. John Bolton kept saying, oh, we went for the wrong country, we should have gone for Iran. And so the Bush administration was increasing tension with Iran, which played quite an important role in banking sanctions. And banking sanctions are, if you like, modern way of imposing sanctions. So 3 of Iran's main banks, where most people, whatever they do, have some kind of link to it, Saderat, Sepah, and the Bank Melli, which is the national bank, not the central bank of Iran, but the national bank, were part of these sanctions. The Obama administration continued all of these sanctions, but now we had an administration that had Hillary Clinton as its minister for State Department minister, and we heard all these nice words came along. Comprehensive sanctions was one that was used. Smart sanctions was another one that was used. Targeted sanctions was another one that was used. Now, these were to reassure everyone that, oh, everything was going to be organized, because they have such a good way of targeting specific individuals. It's going to be so comprehensive, ordinary people will not suffer, only those in power, and only those involved in the development of a nuclear bomb. I mean, how could you say that in a dictatorship when no one, even within the leadership, doesn't know exactly who is doing what? Anyway, this was going to be the targeted sanctions. And these Obama sanctions lasted until 2015, where, as you know, his administration and the European Union, together with China and Russia, the whole, if you like, the nuclear powers plus one, which was Germany, signed the Iran nuclear deal. Now, it's important to remember that even then, the sanctions were, some of the sanctions, i.e. the 26 to 2010 sanctions, were eased, and European countries went back to Iran, or at least started discussions with Iran about renewing their economic activities. The US companies, either wary of future Republican administrations or already not too bothered about Iran, hardly any of them went back. So there is this very short period we have, 2015 to January 2017, because January 2017, Trump came to power, right? So we have this very short period, and it's not enough for Europe, even European companies, to go back. For example, Mercedes-Benz, German company, had a plant in Iran. By the time the discussions were going on about how to reopen the factory, how to reorganize the business, we had Trump elected in November 2016. So there was no point for them to continue. And Trump's election, if you remember, the two things, apart from, I don't know, hang Clinton or whatever, one of his main themes was, I'm going to walk out of the Iran nuclear deal. This was part of his election bravado. There was no doubt by anybody that he would leave the Iran nuclear deal. So the sanctions, really, the US sanctions were very strong against Iran throughout that period. And nobody went back. Nobody decided it was time to go back. By 2019, we had I think what we had was the Trump administration being aware that it might not get elected. Right? It wasn't very clear. I mean, as you know, he denied he was defeated even after he lost the election, but he was preparing the ground in case he didn't win. So in November, and in fact, after he lost the election, or we knew he'd lost, but he didn't seem to know he'd lost. In November 2019 to January 2020, he imposed a whole set of new sanctions against Iran. And there's two ways of looking at this. One of them is that he wanted to punish Biden, which had some effect, but also to confuse the matter, because even if Biden now, in his negotiations, tries to go back to the Iran nuclear deal, it's not very clear what he can do with the 2019 sanctions. The 2019 sanctions are, if you like, not related directly to the nuclear program. They're a bit in the category of 1979 sanctions, which you remember I started with. So there's a whole set of sanctions that is the debating issue right now in Vienna in terms of what can we do about it. So Iran manages still and has managed throughout this period to sell oil. And how has it managed to do so? And this is important because when we come to Russia, we can see that that is quite a significant sanction busting effort or way of doing. So it has sold oil to China mainly. China's import of Iranian oil keeps going up, as far as I can tell. It also does barter with allied countries. I'm not sure if it's more for propaganda purposes or it actually works, but for example, Iran exchanged oil with Venezuela and got paid in gold. As I will talk later, the hegemon powers complete domination of the financial sector in the world and banking in the world makes money exchanges very difficult. So you do go back to barter of gold versus oil. Whether that was worth the effort, you have to take oil right across the world, basically, to the other side of the world, I don't know. The problems that countries face then, and Russia is not facing that yet, is that very few insurance companies agree to insure tankers that are carrying Iranian oil. And for a couple of years, 2019, 2020, up until COVID, basically, Iran had great difficulty with that. But they managed to overcome this. And I think, as far as I know, some Chinese firms and an Indian insurer have, in fact, stepped in to reduce the volatility. Iran sells 700 to 900,000 barrels of oil a day to China, a day. That's quite a high figure. And in some ways, this is the, if you like, the conflict between Iran and Russia. Because Iran and Russia, as you know, for example, regarding the Ukraine war, are allies. Iran supports Russia's efforts and so on. But economically, they are rivals because Iran wants to sell oil more than Russia. So there is a, if you like, a contradiction between the two in that way. How does sanctions affect ordinary people, these targeted, comprehensive, smart sanctions? I think in the 1980s, when the sanctions were part of war, most people saw what is often called siege mentality, saw this as an attack on their country, saw this as part of war, and the government had quite a solid support in terms of opposition to sanctions. Here, I think maybe Russia is the same, but in Iran, the sense of nationalism is quite strong. People still remember as children, they grow up with stories of nasty Greeks fighting them and defeating them. They burnt out all our palaces. Persepolis was the greatest place on earth had it not been for Alexander, and so on. So that sense of, if you like, nationalism goes beyond who is in power, and that was quite effective in the 1980s. I think now we see a far more mixed reaction, and I think that's that would probably be similar, and is very difficult. I don't know Russia enough. Russia is a far more complicated and multinational country than Iran is. But I would assume that the initial reactions to sanction is one of we will survive this. We will be one nation in fighting this. Maybe I'm wrong. Now reactions are more mixed, and the reasons they have eroded is explained actually by Iranian government people themselves. They say those who are not in the circles that have made huge fortunes through sanctions, and I will explain how you make money through sanctions, are saying, well, in the 1980s, people looked at sanctions and saw how everybody was in the same boat. Now they look at sanctions and see how multimillionaires from within the government, from the circles of power, have made money because of sanctions, and therefore they don't see themselves as part of the same boat. And it's certainly true that if you like, the street protest we've seen against price rises in the last few months are examples of this. But how do people make money? So the people who made millions in Iran are mainly connected to senior ayatollahs, senior clerics, very much part of the state. And the rebel commanders of Iran Revolutionary Guard, as well as the ministers, former ministers, their close relatives. So how do you work this? This is partly because of the way Black economy works. I mean, in a country like Iran with the bazaar under the Shah, who then led to the clerics taking power, I would say entrepreneurial Islamic clerics were not a new phenomenon. We already were quite familiar with them. In power, they showed they can use their entrepreneurial skills in a far more widespread, far more effective way. The nuclear sanctions have created 3 sets of currency in Iran. So we have the official currency, which is almost 1/10 of the free market currency. And we, just to complicate matters, Rouhani created a 3rd currency called Nima. This 3rd currency is controlled by the central bank. It was a state measure to reduce the effects of sanctions, which Trump was adding every week, basically, or every month to Iran, in terms of prices. So there's a 3rd one. This one is halfway, almost, no, it's closer to the free market rate, but it's still a 1/3 of the free market rate, okay? So if you're a minister or a State Department, and those who impose sanctions are well aware that this is how the system will work. Those who are in power have access to the official rate of exchange. They import goods at the official rate and sell it at the free market rate. So if you look at any of items for sale in Tehran in the last decade, they move with the dollar. So because the country imports so much of its food items and basic items, so if you look at the price of egg, for example, or fruits in particular, it goes up as the dollar changes value. And the dollar has changed value by about 10 times what it was before the Trump administration's sanctions, right? So now $1 is 420,000 reals, which is 42,000 tomans, right? Okay, so if you take, if you like, the pound version of it, it's 42,000 tomans. And if your salary is even $1 million or 2 million or whatever, I mean, whatever, you just can't buy very basic items because you can't afford it. People keep writing in social media where we've stopped eating meat, we then stopped eating eggs. Now we can't even afford macaroni, which is pasta really, or rice, because they are expensive, they are too expensive. What do we feed our people? Amongst the many experts on Iran's sanctions, of course, in the Brooklyn Institute, there is Professor Maloney, and she writes, I think correctly, that Iran isn't just an oil seller. So it does produce goods. And so the economy has survived. It isn't that it has died down. I know it looks like 50% inflation, this kind of prices, but the economy has survived. How does it do it? It has unofficial relations with neighboring countries, and therefore does actually send manufactured goods, foods, and so on to those countries. But payment via banks is more difficult. So one of the ironies of the whole, thing is that there's this organization called Gemini, and it produces a world wealth report. Now, Iran's Islamic Republic has the biggest rise in the number of high net worth individuals in 2020. Yeah? So this is, remember, they were targeted sanctions that were going to deal with the nuclear, with only the elite, those in power. Iran has 250,000 millionaires. These are not Iran millionaires because, as I explained to you, Iran million doesn't mean anything. They are dollar millionaires, okay? And in fact, Iran can boast to have more millionaires than Spain, Russia, Brazil, and even Saudi Arabia, because obviously the country is bigger. So. And Saudi Arabia is ranked 17 as the number of high net worth individuals. Iran is 40. This is really strange because the population of Iran during this period has increased by 21.6%. Yet the millionaires have, the wealth of its millionaires has grown by 24%. The way this works is that it's not manufacturing, it's not production, it's finance. And it's financed through the black market. So there are ways in which this is done. The nation's income has gone down, but the rich people's income has exploded, basically. And there are very large figures about how the wealth of the country has gone down. According to Iran's former Foreign Minister Javad Zarif, who was speaking in 2021, we can say that $1 trillion damage to the economy between 2016 and 2021. That's quite a large figure. There are foreign direct investments decreased from 5 billion in 2017 to 1.5 billion in 2019. So these are really large figures. People are moving their trade, their manufacturing. Exports plunged from 111 billion in 2017 to 98 billion in 18, and then 29 billion by 2020. So it really, if you look at the figures, these are quite considerable poverty for the country, while these rich people were getting richer and richer. And of course, quite a lot of this is what is called in Iran Agazadeh. Agazadeh means children of senior ayatollahs, basically. And these are families of senior ayatollahs, families of revolutionary commanders. This experience that I was telling you about, selling, buying with the official rate, selling with the unofficial rate, affected one guy. He is the father of the son-in-law of Rouhani, former president, right? He's called Sultan Moz in Iran. Sultan means, as you know, Sultan, like the Ottoman Emperor. Moz is banana. And he's called Sultan Moz because he imports bananas on the official rates and sells them about, I don't know, a lot more. I mean, he makes a profit 10 times more importing just like that. So it really is amazing stuff. Yeah, the way all of this is managed in terms of global finance, and I will try and sum up here, is through this banking system. So basically, all the trade we are seeing in Iran, all the money that we are seeing is being sent abroad. All these people that were supposedly victims of smart sanctions have accounts. In Canada is one of the places where most of Iran's senior clerics and their relatives have large accounts, apparently. Belgium is another country where a family of a senior Ayatollah is an owner of full chain hotel chains, right? So these people have moved their money out. But on paper, you're told that SWIFT is controlling finances and will stop all of this. These smart sanctions will work because SWIFT is so good. So what is SWIFT? It basically is a messaging system that connects something like 11,000 banks and financial institutions. And it covers 200 countries. It's like, so you send money, there is like a message that is stored on a computer. Officially, it is in Belgium, its headquarters are in Belgium, but the US Federal Reserve is very much in control of what is going on there, and the Europe and the UK, Bank of England, oversees the operation of the Belgian bank. And what it does is that it's now, SWIFT has been very harsh on Iranian banks. And it affects ordinary Iranians who don't have access to government corrupt system. So if you're a student, you suddenly can't have a card unless if you're an Iranian student. And now we've seen it in my institution, if you're a Russian student. You can't have a bank card that you can use for anything unless all your money has always been abroad. So if you're the son of an oligarch, you might be okay because your relatives have bank accounts that have no input or output from Moscow because all the money has already been smuggled out to Cayman Islands or London or wherever your family has the money. But if you're an ordinary students, some of the Iranian students I've met are very strongly opposed to the regimes themselves, but their account is frozen. And SWIFT works quite irrationally. Suddenly, all your accounts are frozen when they found out you've had, say, £100 sent by your mum from Tehran. It works really. One of my relatives faced all her accounts frozen in Italy because her father had sent her some money. And yet, people who have access to the central bank in Tehran, like the leaders of the Islamic Republic, can move around these smart sanctions. And I assume even take suitcases full of dollars and pounds and whatever abroad to Canada or wherever. So it really does affect ordinary people, makes the poor poorer because they can't afford basic foods, makes the rich richer, makes those in power more powerful. And far from, if you like, making the governments weaker and scared of the sanctions that the US has imposed, especially for humanitarian reasons, for democracy, for the right of that nation to vote for whoever they want, except someone that the US doesn't like. For all of this, it actually empowers those who are in government. And far from reducing repression, it increases repression. Governments then blame sanction for everything. No, now, the one thing to say about the terrible economic situation in Iran, this unbelievable gap between the rich and the poor, it's not just sanctions, it's also nepotism, corruption, it's bad economics, it's dependence on rentier economy, the whole neoliberal economic policies of the state. But at all times, the government has a very good excuse. It is sanctions that is causing the problem. And I think the same will be true, probably, although it's very, as I said, I'm not well informed enough about Russia, but it will be similar in some ways in Russia. Now, the only thing I want to add is that in some ways, the Russians expected some of the sanctions that have been imposed. The SWIFT sanctions against Russia are not as omnipresent as the ones against Iran. So a number of banks, I think 7 banks, were originally in the SWIFT lists that the US and the Europe allies, the international community, which basically means US and its allies, imposed. It did not, first of all, include the Spare Bank, which is one of the bigger banks, but by June, they added that. One of the banks that, as far as I know, is still not in this is the one linked to the oil Gazprom bank. So there is a Gazprom bank, and Germany is obviously keen that it should remain out of any sanctions because of the dependence on oil. It has increased China's relations with Russia. And it started, I would say, between 2014 and 2017, where 151 billion were the official loans from Chinese institutions to Russia. Russia trade with China was estimated at 145 billion in 2021. And it's interesting that the banks that are dealing with Russian loans or Russian trade are banks that China has moved out of dollar accounting. Whether they can do this decoupling from the dollar, which is their aim, remains to be seen. But it is true to say that even now we are talking that in the first quarter of, in the second quarter of 2022, dollar share of global exchange fell to less than 59%. This is the first time this decoupling that China and Russia seem to be aiming is having an effect. It's still a very long way. 59% is still shows the dominance of banks. There is a bank called China Cross-Border International Payment System, CIPS, which is really trying to take over from SWIFT. So if you like, SWIFT is the West's way of doing this. That one is trying to work on that. I don't see it happening that soon. So basically, just to sum up, I would say sanctions are the same as the blockade of the earlier history. They are part of war. They are actually part of Cold War, Hot War, whichever way you look at it, it's part of war. So far, the list of failures for sanctions is very long. Cuba, North Korea, Iraq until the war happened, Iran, and one could say Russia as well, unless it becomes a war. That's a different thing, that becomes a hot war. And it hasn't led to regime change. It hasn't even, I would also argue, contrary to what Mike was saying, that I don't think it will lead to a rebellion of oligarchs, the mafia in Russia, to depose Putin. Because as far as I can see, some of them moved their money, they had the time. Many of them between 2014 and 2022 knew this might be happening and had already invested in the Cayman Islands or wherever, or in London, where their property is safe. Their property, not their finance, not their yachts, maybe, not their money in the bank, but their property will be safe. They have moved this money to other names, other individuals. We can't see, I see no sign except one or two oligarchs, and they are not the major oligarchs, taking on Putin. The Velvet Revolution that Mike predicts requires these oligarchs to change side. You can't just change side without the economic mafia that runs the Russian economy. And I would say the sanctions will not work. Putin's rating seems to be going up because of nationalism. And that is true of looking back at the earlier sanctions against the Islamic Republic. I would say that's the same pattern. And I know that a lot of ordinary Russians would have lost their jobs because of the economic sanctions, but I don't think that it has had the kind of disastrous effects that was predicted by the US. And last but not least, I think there are many people are saying this, the sanctions imposed on Russia by the US and by the international community is creating or increasing the existing economic problems in Europe and in the United Kingdom. There is no denying that. They might try and not promote this idea, but there is no denying that. And whether it will be, I think this time, because of the way these economies are integrated and work together one way or another, this time these sanctions could have counterproductive as opposed to just enriching the people in one country. They will have counterproductive effects, but I might be wrong. That's it. I'll finish.